Rome had burned, emperors had fallen, and chaos ruled the empire that once ruled the world. Into that ruin stepped Vespasian, a soldier, not a noble, pragmatic where others dreamed. He rebuilt not through glory, but through endurance, shaping stability from ashes. His legions secured the frontiers. His taxes raised the Colosseum. His discipline restored faith in Rome itself. Yet power always demands a price. Loyalty strained, ambition restrained, history rewritten. Vespasian's reign proved that restoration can be as revolutionary as conquest. The moment when Rome learned survival, not splendor, was the truest mark of greatness. The empire was dying in its own brilliance. After a century of dominion, Rome had become a reflection of its emperors, glittering, exhausted, and haunted by its grandeur. Across the Mediterranean, legions marched not against barbarians, but against each other. In the summer of 69 AD, the smoke of civil war mingled with the perfume of burned incense, and what had begun as a city of laws had turned into a theater of ambition, where the sword and the Senate took turns deciding who ruled the world. In the east, where the desert met the sea, one general kept his silence. He was no patrician, no philosopher of empire, merely a soldier who had learned to survive its storms. His name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Around him, the legions of Judea waited for command, scarred men whose loyalty had outlasted Nero's madness. Rome was tearing itself apart. Galba had fallen, Otho had ruled for weeks before dying by his own hand, and Vitellius, drunk on victory, played emperor among corpses. Yet while others shouted their titles, Vespasian said nothing. He watched the western sky burn each night and told his officers only that Rome had lived through worse, though in his heart he knew it might not live through this. Soldiers whispered that the mule breeder of Reate might soon become emperor. He laughed once at the rumor, a sound half weary, half amused, for he understood better than any man how the empire truly worked. Power chose the patient. To understand why the legions looked east for salvation, one must return to the hills that shaped him. Far from the marble of the capital, the Sabine countryside breathed the older Rome, a landscape of stone terraces, olive groves, and stubborn men. There, near the little village of Phalacrina, Vespasian was born in the 9th year after Christ's birth. His family, the Flavii, belonged neither to the nobility nor to the crowd. They were equestrians, Italian stock of modest means who served the state without ever touching its glory. His father, Titus Flavius Sabinus, was a tax collector turned banker, a man who counted sesterces more carefully than prayers. His mother, Vespasia Polla, descended from municipal magistrates and carried herself with the pride of a patrician she had never been. The boy grew up among mules and mountains, learning early that strength came from endurance rather than pedigree. His father's trade taught thrift. His mother's lineage insisted on dignity, and between the two, he learned restraint. His elder brother, Sabinus, was quick and charming, the favorite of family hopes. Vespasian moved in his shadow, deliberate and quiet, observing rather than performing. Neighbors thought him slow, but his mother saw something steadier, a will that did not break under weight. She decided that the boy who resembled his grandfather the soldier should not die a farmer. Rome rewards the stubborn, she told him. Be stubborn. So he went to Rome. The journey from Reate to the capital was short in distance, but immense in meaning. From the scent of tilled earth to the reek of marble dust and politics. The city he found under Tiberius was a place of splendor built upon suspicion. Senators walked softly. The Praetorian Guard listened at doors, and the air itself seemed to whisper of informers. Into this world arrived a provincial youth whose Latin carried the rhythm of the hills and whose purse contained little more than hope. He found a post as a clerk, one of the countless hands that kept the empire's bureaucracy alive. Days vanished in parchment and ink. Nights he spent wandering the forum, reading the names carved on the pedestals of forgotten heroes. What impressed him most was not their victories, but their silence. Stone endured where voices faded. Rome taught him patience. Advancement came not through brilliance, but through endurance. Those who shouted were noticed. Those who endured were remembered. Watching the emperor's favorites rise and fall, Vespasian learned to measure ambition by survival. When he finally secured entry into the cursus honorum, the ladder of public office, it was less a leap upward than the next cautious step of a man who had memorized every rung before touching it. His mother's savings bought him a place in the army. Her letters reminded him that modest beginnings required impeccable service. Thrace was his first proving ground, a frontier of mountains and snow where obedience was a virtue and hesitation a death sentence. The post of military tribune brought authority without glory, command without comfort. There he discovered the unspoken law of the legions. Discipline replaces genius. He ate with his men, endured their cold, and shared their humor. When storms buried the camps, he helped dig them out. "A mule's patience," said one centurion, half mocking, half admiring. The name stayed. In time, the patience became habit, and the habit became his armor. Years of service hardened him into a soldier's shape. Broad shoulders, thick hands, and an expression that gave nothing away. He learned to lead by example rather than rhetoric, to speak only when certainty was worth the words. The army, unlike the Senate, respected such economy. Promotions came slowly but steadily, and when his term in Thrace ended, he returned to Rome with scars instead of stories, the sort of man who could be trusted with unpleasant tasks because he would never dramatize them. The capital greeted him as it greeted all veterans, with indifference. Power belonged to those who stayed visible, and Vespasian had spent years out of sight. Still, his brother Sabinus had risen in the administration, and through him came another appointment, small but significant, a junior role in the city's grain service. There, among ledgers and cargo lists, he learned how the empire fed itself, how provinces existed to keep Rome's stomach full, how gold and wheat were the twin arteries of its survival. It was a revelation as profound as any victory. A man who controlled the flow of resources could outlast armies. He remembered the lesson. Around this time, he married Domitilla the Elder, a woman of modest beauty and unyielding virtue. Their union lacked the glitter of politics, but possessed something rarer: compatibility. She shared his suspicion of extravagance, his fondness for blunt speech, his belief that thrift was a civic duty. Their household on the Quirinal Hill became known for its austerity. Servants learned not to waste oil. Guests learned that conversation mattered more than display. From this plain domestic order would later emerge a dynasty that rebuilt Rome's confidence in government. For now, it was simply a home held together by discipline. As the empire drifted under Caligula and Claudius, Vespasian's career inched forward. He supervised markets, inspected streets, and handled the sort of work noblemen considered beneath them. When the streets overflowed with filth, Caligula mocked him publicly, ordering refuse poured into his toga, a humiliation meant to remind provincials of their place. Vespasian bowed, endured the laughter, and returned to his duties. Others would have protested. He understood that survival often required silence. In the poisonous hierarchy of imperial favor, Anonymity was safer than attention, yet attention found him. Through the influence of Narcissus, a freedman in Claudius's household, Vespasian received his first real command, legate of the Second Legion Augusta, stationed in Germany. It was an honor that could make or end a career. His mother, old now but still sharp, sent a final letter before he sailed. "You have the look of one whom Rome will remember," she wrote. He kept the letter folded inside his breastplate for the rest of his life. The transfer changed everything. He was no longer a bureaucrat with ink on his fingers, but a commander with thousands of men at his word. Discipline became his religion. He drilled the legion until its movements were one breath. He mended its finances, enforced pay on time, banned gambling, and won grudging respect. When the Emperor Claudius prepared his invasion of Britain in 43 AD, the Second Legion was ready, and Vespasian with it. The cold shores of the New World awaited him, and with them the first taste of fame. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, as the ship left the port of Ostia, the wind carrying the smell of tar and salt, Vespasian stood on deck, watching the Italian coast sink behind the waves. The sea stretched before him like a promise and a warning. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay battles that would prove his worth. Somewhere farther still, the destiny he neither sought nor imagined. He was 40, broad of frame, spare of speech, content to serve. Behind him, Rome glittered in its deceit. Ahead waited the mist and mud of Britain, the test that would teach him how to command men, and in time, how to rule them. He did not dream of the purple or of history's judgment. He thought only of duty, of his family waiting in their modest house, of his mother's voice telling him to be stubborn. The sails filled, the coastline faded, and the empire's most unlikely savior vanished into the horizon. Another soldier departing on imperial business, carrying within him the endurance of the hills and the patience of the mule that bore his name. The invasion of Britain began beneath a grey sky, on the beaches of Gaul, where the wind rolled over dunes and the sea churned with uncertainty. 4 legions waited for the signal to sail. Among them stood the Second Augusta, commanded by Vespasian, a man more accustomed to dust than salt. The soldiers had heard whispers that the ocean itself was haunted, that monsters waited beyond the horizon to devour any who dared cross it. Their courage faltered until Vespasian walked the shoreline in silence, his cloak soaked by spray, his voice calm when he finally spoke. The sea is no more alive than fear. That night, the ships set sail. When the Roman prows struck the British coast, resistance failed to appear. The tribes had scattered, lulled by rumor that the invasion had been abandoned. For a moment, the gods seemed Roman. But Britain was no gift. It was a test. The mist-covered hills hid a people who would not submit easily. And in those first weeks, Vespasian learned that conquest required patience more than valor. His men marched through forests that swallowed sound, crossed rivers that seemed to move against them, and built their camps from earth soaked in rain. The legions that followed him through those campaigns would later call him stone-faced, a commander who spoke little and expected much, but who never asked of others what he would not do himself. At the River Medway, the war began in earnest. The British tribes had rallied behind their warrior, Prince Caraticus, and lined the opposite bank with spears and defiance. The water ran high and fast, promising to drown any who tried to cross. Vespasian studied the current, watched the enemy shift, and ordered his Dutch auxiliaries, men trained to swim in armor, to ford the river in silence before dawn. When the sun rose, the Britons found themselves attacked from behind. Panic tore through their ranks. Vespasian led his legions straight into the river. wading waist-deep beneath a storm of arrows, and struck at the heart of the resistance. By nightfall, the field was his. That victory opened the way into southern Britain, and the emperor rewarded him with a personal commendation. Yet what marked him was not triumph, but restraint. The campaign that followed was brutal, fought among Iron Age fortresses carved into the hills. Each stronghold fell the same way. The Roman artillery would pound the walls until fire licked through thatch, and the survivors, dazed by smoke, would surrender. Vespasian refused to turn these battles into spectacles. Rome does not conquer for glory, he told his officers. It conquers to stop fighting. After years in Britain, the Flavian name began to carry weight. News of his successes reached the capital, and the mule breeder's son from Reate became a general whose discipline impressed even the cynical courtiers of Claudius. When the emperor paraded through the streets of Rome, celebrating his conquest of the island, Vespasian marched behind his chariot, one among the men who had made the claim credible. His reward was the ornamenta triumphalia, the trappings of triumph, but not the triumph itself. Such honors belonged to emperors, not their servants. Still, it was enough to secure his family's future. The young Titus watched his father's return with awe. Domitilla, ever practical, reminded them both that fame was a fickle creditor. For a time, Rome forgot about its quiet hero. Claudius grew old, his court poisoned by intrigue. Agrippina, his ambitious wife, maneuvered her son Nero toward succession, and those who had once been close to the emperor drifted into retirement or exile. Vespasian withdrew to the countryside, tending to his estates and rebuilding his finances, which had suffered from the cost of command. He might have ended his life there, a respected veteran, a relic of a steadier generation, had the empire not fallen into chaos once more. Nero's reign began with music and ended with fire. The emperor, who fancied himself an artist, emptied the treasury on vanity projects, declaring himself the embodiment of divine harmony while the provinces starved. Vespasian, summoned to court to report on the legions, endured the new Caesar's performances in weary silence. During one endless recital, he was seen to doze off. That act of mortal fatigue nearly ended his career. Nero, enraged, banished him from sight. He returned again to his home in Reate, living among the same hills that had raised him, his name temporarily erased from imperial memory. Fate, however, remembered him. In 66 AD, revolt broke out in Judea. The legions stationed there were routed, their standards captured, their commanders humiliated. The empire needed a soldier it could trust, someone competent, unglamorous, obedient to reason rather than impulse. There were few such men left. Vespasian, now in his late 50s, received the summons he had not expected. He accepted without ceremony, packed the same worn armor he had worn in Britain, and set sail for the east. The journey brought him back to Caesarea, the coastal jewel of the Roman East. From there, he surveyed the problem that would define his legend. Judea was aflame. The Jewish rebels had taken Jerusalem, massacred garrisons, and declared independence under their own priests and kings. The revolt had spiritual fire, and against that, even Rome's machines could falter. Vespasian began not with attack, but with order. He reorganized supply routes, restored discipline to shattered legions, and reminded every soldier that no rebellion could survive against patience. Campaigning. Through Galilee, he laid siege to the fortress of Jotapata, where resistance had gathered under a learned man named Josephus. For 40 days, the Romans battered the walls until the city fell in blood and smoke. Out of the ruins, a single survivor was brought before him. Josephus, once a rebel, claimed to have seen a vision that Vespasian himself would one day rule Rome. The general laughed but spared him, perhaps amused, perhaps already aware that prophecy and politics often marched together. While he fought in the east, the empire unraveled behind him. Nero, deserted by all, slit his own throat, and the line of the Caesars ended. The year of the four emperors began. Galba ruled for months before being hacked down by his own guard. Otho followed and died by suicide. Vitellius rose next, a glutton masquerading as Caesar. From the Euphrates to the Rhine, soldiers muttered that Rome had gone mad. In Judea, Vespasian continued his campaign as though none of it mattered. Yet reports came daily, provinces changing allegiance, legions marching under new banners. The world he had served faithfully was collapsing again. He might have stayed a soldier if not for Egypt. Alexandria, guardian of the empire's grain, turned to him for leadership. Its prefect, recognizing that whoever controlled the harvest controlled Rome, declared loyalty to Vespasian. Soon, Syria and the eastern armies followed. In the summer of 69, his son Titus urged him to accept what destiny and necessity both demanded. Vespasian hesitated only once. "I have never desired a crown," he said, "but perhaps the empire needs a man who does not." In July, the legions hailed him emperor. The mule breeder's son had become master of the world. Yet even then, he stayed in Egypt to secure the grain fleet, leaving his generals to fight for Rome in his name. By December, Vitellius was dead, his body dragged through the streets, and the civil war was over. When news of victory reached Alexandria, Vespasian was inspecting a warehouse of grain. He nodded once, gave no speech, and returned to his work. An empire could be saved, he believed, only by men who still counted the bushels. The winter winds swept over the Nile as ships loaded for the voyage to Italy. On their decks, soldiers whispered that they were carrying not just grain, but the new peace of Rome. In the east, temples prepared sacrifices to Fortuna. In the west, senators rehearsed flattery. Yet among all the rejoicing, Vespasian remained unmoved. He had seen too much of war and fortune to trust either. His thoughts were with the city that had once poured filth into his toga, the same city that now begged him to rule it. When he finally arrived in Rome the following year, he entered without spectacle. No triumphal arch awaited him, no theatrical procession. He walked through the ruins of Nero's Golden House, now abandoned, and ordered it stripped to build housing for citizens. The emperor who had inherited chaos began by cleaning. Rome had chosen a soldier to save her, and he began the task in the only way he knew, by working. Those who watched him that day saw no flash of divine inspiration, no gesture of imperial pride. They saw a man from the hills of Reate, grey-haired and broad-handed, pausing in the sunlight to study the city he had outlasted. Perhaps he remembered the scent of his mother's fields, or the discipline of Thrace, or the silence before the river Medway. Perhaps he remembered nothing at all. What mattered was that Rome still stood, and he, against all reason, now bore its weight. History would call him the restorer of order, the founder of a dynasty, the emperor who brought Rome back from the brink. He would call himself only what he had always been, a Roman who worked. From the frozen ridges of Thrace to the grey plains of Britain, Vespasian had crossed its boundaries and learned what it meant to keep a world together. Every province bore the mark of Rome, yet none resembled the city that ruled them. In each he found a different rhythm of obedience, some born of admiration, others of fear, and by serving among them, he began to understand the empire's secret. It did not endure through might alone, but through the habit of order. Years of marching left him with a soldier's instincts and an administrator's patience. He had seen how governors could undo with greed what armies had won with steel, how a missed shipment of grain could ignite revolt, and how loyalty could wither faster than crops in a dry season. To survive such a system required precision. He carried that precision into every post he held, measuring his words as carefully as his steps. After Britain, his career advanced under Claudius. The emperor, pragmatic and easily swayed, relied on men who obeyed more than they questioned. Vespasian fit the type perfectly, disciplined, unassuming, without the dangerous eloquence of a politician. He was appointed quaestor, responsible for managing the public treasury in the provinces of Crete and Cyrene. The job seemed minor, yet it offered him his first clear view of how the empire truly functioned, not through decrees carved on marble, but through coin, grain, and compromise. The journey to North Africa brought him into lands older than Rome itself. Cyrene's white columns gleamed beneath a blinding sun, relics of a Hellenic world that had once ruled the sea. The city's wealth came from fertile plains and long trade routes that stretched east toward Egypt and west toward Carthage. Here, Vespasian was not only an officer, but an accountant, overseeing the collection of taxes, the repair of roads, and the arbitration of local disputes. The work demanded patience, diplomacy, and a stomach for corruption. He provided all three in measure. The people of Cyrene knew how to flatter Roman officials. They offered statues and banquets, but Vespasian accepted neither. He inspected their granaries instead, ensured that shipments bound for Italy were not diluted with dust, and dismissed petitioners who tried to purchase leniency. Some called him cold, others incorruptible. Both were true. His colleagues, often bored or disillusioned, mocked his diligence. "Why guard the emperor's purse," one asked, "when it will soon be emptied by his friends?" Vespasian answered only that empires rot from small thefts, not great wars. In the evenings, he walked the terraces above the sea, watching the sails disappear into the crimson horizon. For the first time, he saw the empire as a living circuit, grain flowing north, silver returning south, men and ideas crossing endlessly between them. Rome was not merely a city, it was a system. To serve it well was to understand that system, and he began to do so with an accountant's clarity. His tenure in Cyrene ended without scandal, which was itself a rarity. When he returned to Rome, the Senate took notice of his efficiency. In a world accustomed to ostentation, his modest reports stood out for their precision. The next rung awaited him. Aedile, supervisor of Rome's public works and streets. It was an office that could elevate or ruin a career, depending on how well one endured ridicule. The capital, still swelling beyond its capacity, was a labyrinth of tenements, markets, and aqueducts. Fires and floods were frequent, filth constant. As aedile, Vespasian became responsible for keeping the streets clean and the water flowing, a thankless duty that demanded constant inspection. His soldiers were replaced by slaves, his battlefield by alleyways. Yet he treated the task as seriously as any campaign. He walked the Subura before dawn, checking drains and cisterns himself. Rome, he decided, was no less dangerous than war. The enemy here was decay. Unfortunately, his diligence drew the emperor's attention at the worst possible time. Caligula had inherited the throne, and his reign had turned madness into ceremony. When the streets overflowed after a storm, the young Caesar accused his officials of negligence. Vespasian was summoned, made to stand before the court, while the emperor mocked his provincial sense of cleanliness. and ordered a heap of refuse poured over his toga. Laughter filled the hall. Vespasian bowed, wiped the filth from his face, and said nothing. His silence saved him. Others, humiliated, might have fled or plotted revenge. He returned to work the next morning. Years later, when the story reached Claudius, the older emperor remarked, "Only a mule could bear such weight and keep walking." From that humiliation grew a reputation for endurance that even his enemies respected. When Caligula fell to assassins and Claudius rose in his place, the new emperor sought stability. Vespasian was among those recalled to service, his name recommended by Narcissus, the powerful freedman who managed imperial correspondence. Through that patronage, he received command of the Second Legion once more, stationed in Germany. The appointment marked his return from obscurity to significance. Germany hardened him further. The Rhine frontier was restless, its tribes still half-conquered, its winters unrelenting. He reorganized the camps, rebuilt watchtowers, and retrained men grown lax after years of peace. He refused bribes, punished theft, and maintained an iron rhythm of inspection. His officers grumbled that he worked them like new recruits. His soldiers respected him for the same reason. He understood that an army's discipline was the empire's heartbeat. Once it slowed, everything else followed. It was during these years that he first commanded not as a subordinate, but as an architect of campaigns. When Claudius announced his intention to invade Britain, the Second Legion was among those chosen for the expedition. For Vespasian, it was a return to unfinished ground. He remembered the cold rain, the silence of forests, and the way victory there had defined his youth. But this time, he sailed not as a hopeful tribune, but as a proven commander trusted with an entire legion. The invasion succeeded, and his name, once again, reached the capital in dispatches. Claudius, eager for heroes to legitimize his reign, granted Vespasian triumphal honors. His star rose swiftly, too swiftly for comfort. At court, success was a liability. A general admired by soldiers could become a rival. Vespasian sensed the danger and withdrew, declining further commands. He spent the next decade alternating between minor administrative posts and quiet retreats to his estates. It was not idleness. It was survival. He had seen too many brilliant men perish from ambition. Meanwhile, the empire continued its ceaseless rotation of emperors, wives, and freedmen. Under Nero, extravagance replaced order. Gold vanished into palaces, and the treasury shrank to parchment promises. Vespasian, now in his 50s, lived like a farmer. He oversaw his vineyards, counted his tenants' harvests, and trained his sons in the virtues of thrift. When officials visited, they found him in plain tunic, hands rough with work. "A senator," one remarked, "should look like marble." He replied, "Marble cracks." Then came Africa. In 63 AD, the governorship of that province fell vacant, and the emperor, perhaps wishing to be rid of an honest man, appointed Vespasian. The posting was both reward and exile, distant enough to be safe, vital enough to be useful. He accepted, knowing that fortune often disguised itself as banishment. Africa was vast, a patchwork of deserts and fertile coasts, Greek cities gleaming beside Berber hills. From Carthage to Leptis, Magna stretched a land that fed Rome's people and entertained them with beasts for their games. The governor ruled as emperor in miniature, collecting taxes, enforcing law, and keeping peace among rival tribes. Vespasian governed as he had always fought, methodically without spectacle. He rebuilt aqueducts, repaired roads, and prosecuted corrupt officials with quiet relentlessness. To the merchants, he was fair. To the lazy, merciless. Yet the province offered temptations that tested even the most frugal. Governors were expected to enrich themselves. The empire tolerated it as long as tribute flowed north. Vespasian refused. He left Africa poorer than he had arrived, but his name carried new weight. An honest man in an age that had forgotten honesty. Later, when the empire would beg for integrity, that reputation would crown him before any army did. By the time he returned to Rome, his finances were depleted. To recover, he returned briefly to trade, managing transport contracts for the state. It was humble work for a senator, but it kept his household solvent. The jesters called him the muleteer of the empire. He did not correct them. Mules were patient. They carried burdens others could not. The name became his shield and his symbol. When Nero later invited him to accompany his tour of Greece, Vespasian agreed out of duty, not delight. The emperor sang, danced, and demanded applause. The general endured it in silence until fatigue betrayed him. He nodded off during a performance, and the act nearly cost him his life. Dismissed in disgrace, he retired once more to Reate, awaiting either recall or ruin. But the world was shifting again. Rebellions smoldered in Gaul and Spain, and in the east, the Jewish uprising flared beyond control. The empire that had once stretched in calm symmetry now trembled at its edges. From the quiet of his farm, Vespasian received the message summoning him back to command. He looked at the hills of his childhood, at the patient beasts grazing where his father once worked, and understood that the road which had carried him across the empire was leading him home, to the center of power he had never sought. He gathered his armor, old but polished, and set out once more. The muleteer turned general, a man whose whole life had been a lesson in endurance. The empire was calling for order, and there were few left who remembered what order looked like. By the time he reached Judea, the empire he served was already unraveling. Nero's rule had hollowed out the treasury, the provinces smoldered with resentment, and the loyalty of the legions was measured in coin. Vespasian, arriving from the weary quiet of retirement, understood at once what was required. Rome did not need brilliance, it needed repair. The eastern frontier was not new to him. Years earlier, he had walked the marble colonnades of Cyrene and seen how Rome wore its civilization like armor, smooth on the surface, corroded beneath. But Judea was different. Here, the revolt was not born of greed or politics, but of faith. When he landed at Ptolemais and rode inland, he saw not a province in rebellion, but a people at war with meaning itself. The banners that fluttered above the hills were painted not with kings' names, but with prayers. He approached the campaign as a craftsman approaches a cracked wall, without emotion, intent on method. His first act was to measure the land, the hills, the roads, the wells, everything that could sustain resistance. He ordered his engineers to map every fortress and his officers to keep daily accounts of grain. Nothing was left to chance. Those who served under him would later recall his preference for siege over slaughter. Patience, he said, always costs less than passion. When the legions besieged Jotapata, he waited 40 days, reducing the city wall by wall until starvation did the work of the sword. It was there that he first met Josephus, the Jewish commander turned historian, who claimed that the gods had chosen Vespasian for destiny. The general dismissed the prophecy with a shrug, yet kept the man alive. Perhaps he sensed that history had its own uses for witnesses. As the revolt crumbled in Galilee, reports from Rome grew more alarming. Nero's power was dissolving in scandal. Governors whispered rebellion. Messengers arrived from Italy with contradictory seals, one proclaiming loyalty to Galba, another denouncing him. Vespasian received them with the same expression he used for weather reports. He neither declared allegiance nor defiance. His task, as he told his son Titus, was not to decide who ruled Rome, but to ensure that Rome still had something left to rule. Yet neutrality is a fragile shelter. When news came that Galba had been murdered and Otho risen in his place, the legions grew restless. Soldiers who had buried comrades in Britain and Syria wondered why they should fight for emperors who lasted no longer than seasons. Rumors spread through the camps that their commander might restore order himself. Vespasian gave no answer, only tightened discipline. He forbade toasts in his name, punished any who spoke of rebellion, and reminded his men that patience had brought them every victory. But the idea, once born, could not be strangled. In Egypt, the prefect Tiberius Alexander, the empire's grain master, watched the confusion from Alexandria and made his own calculation. Whoever controlled the food supply could starve or feed Rome at will. In the summer of 69, he acted. Without waiting for instruction, he proclaimed Vespasian emperor and swore the Egyptian legions to his name. Syria followed. So did the provinces of Asia and Bithynia. When word reached Caesarea, Vespasian was inspecting siege engines. He read the message, folded it, and said quietly, "So it begins." Unlike the generals before him, he did not march on Rome. He understood that legitimacy could not be seized. It had to appear inevitable. While his allies advanced through the Balkans, he remained in the east, securing the grain fleets that would starve Vitellius into submission. He courted governors with letters promising stability, not revenge, and offered amnesty to any who yielded. Even his propaganda was austere. No divine thunderbolts, no visions of destiny, only the calm image of a soldier restoring order. By autumn, the outcome was clear. The armies of the Danube, led by Antonius Primus, crushed Vitellius's forces at Cremona. Rome descended into anarchy as mobs looted palaces and fires devoured the forum. When the dust cleared, Vitellius lay dead, dragged through the streets he had disgraced. The Senate, eager to survive its own cowardice, declared Vespasian emperor. From Alexandria, he received the news with the same composure that had carried him through battles and humiliations alike. He did not weep, did not rejoice, did not even look toward Italy. "Let Rome heal first," he told his aides. "Then we will visit the patient." He stayed in Egypt to ensure the harvest and grain convoys. Pragmatism defined every act. When asked why he delayed his coronation, he replied that an emperor's first duty was to feed his people, and hunger was the most dangerous rebellion of all. Even as marble statues of his likeness were raised in provincial forums, he spent his days in warehouses counting sacks of wheat, verifying the seals of merchants. Soldiers watched in silence as the most powerful man in the world examined grain as if it were gold. In truth, to him, it was. When he finally returned to Rome, the empire was exhausted. Civil war had left its scars. Towns pillaged, fields barren, treasuries empty. The Senate met him at the city gate, draped in white, praising the return of order. He responded not with speeches, but decrees. Taxes were reorganized, corrupt officials dismissed, and a new census ordered to restore financial balance. He revived the discipline of the legions, rewarding loyalty with land instead of luxury, insisting that service to the state was not a path to indulgence, but to endurance. The people, starved for stability, accepted the austerity as virtue. They admired his rough humor, the way he mocked his own poverty and refused ceremonial extravagance. "I must be emperor," he once joked, "for I cannot afford to resign." Such laughter became policy. He raised revenues not by conquest, but by practicality. New taxes on trade, tolls on public latrines, even a fee for the use of Rome's sewers. When his son Titus protested that such measures were beneath imperial dignity, Vespasian held a coin to his nose. "Do you smell anything foul?" he asked. Titus said no. "Then it is clean enough." The phrase, pecunia non olet, became his motto. Behind that humor lay calculation. He knew the empire's faith could not be restored by ideals. It needed proof of competence. He funded public works, rebuilt the aqueducts, and began the greatest project of his reign, the Flavian Amphitheatre, later called the Colosseum. Erected on the ruins of Nero's private lake, it was both an act of generosity and a lesson. Where tyranny had built for pleasure, he built for people. Where Nero had sung to himself, Vespasian gave the city back its voice. But peace required more than construction. He recalled Titus from Judea, where the final assault on Jerusalem was nearing its dreadful conclusion, and divided authority between his sons. Titus would inherit command and reputation. Domitian, younger and restless, was granted titles to appease his pride. In this, Vespasian began crafting what he hoped would be Rome's first stable dynasty in a century. Yet he did it not from love of power, but from dread of chaos. The empire, he believed, could not survive another year like 69. As months turned into years, his reign acquired a rhythm as measured as his gait. He rose before dawn, heard petitions until noon, and spent the afternoon reviewing accounts or visiting construction sites. Foreign envoys found him standing, never reclining on couches of silk as his predecessors had done. He dined sparingly, spoke plainly, and tolerated jesters who mocked him in public, believing that laughter kept fear at bay. The courtiers called him coarse. The people called him just. Still, not everyone rejoiced in simplicity. The senatorial elite, long accustomed to the pageantry of divine emperors, sneered at the muleteer on the throne. Satirists whispered that his hands smelled of coin, his manners of the stable. He answered with policies rather than vengeance. Those who served the state were promoted. Those who plotted quietly removed. His justice was swift, unadorned, and rarely bloody. A good ruler, he said, is one whose laws seem dull. Through it all, he never forgot the pattern of his own life. The rise through service, the fall through obedience, the rise again through patience. He governed as he had marched, steady pace, straight line. To those who sought glory, his rule seemed colourless. To those who remembered the chaos of Nero and Vitellius, it was salvation. The empire, for the first time in decades, breathed evenly. In his later years, the same humility that had once disguised ambition now became wisdom. When courtiers flattered him as a new Augustus, he laughed and told them Rome needed fewer gods and more accountants. Yet in that laughter was something more profound, the understanding that empires endure only when ruled by men who remember mud underfoot. He would die as he had lived, without pretense, standing upright, refusing to surrender even to death. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, the road that had begun in the hills of Reate stretched across the empire, paved by patience and repaired by endurance, until it reached the Palatine itself. The muleteer had carried the weight of Rome farther than any golden chariot, and as the city slept beneath the glow of new lamps, paid for by his relentless thrift, the emperor who had learned to serve finally allowed himself a rare thought. That service, if honest, was the only lasting conquest Rome had ever achieved. Dawn in Rome did not bring peace. It brought performance. Beneath the gold ceilings of the Palatine, every gesture carried consequence, every silence a risk. The court of Emperor Claudius was less a government than a stage play in which loyalty was rehearsed daily and forgotten by nightfall. Vespasian entered this world not as a nobleman, but as a soldier, plain-spoken, practical, and utterly out of place among courtiers who traded charm like currency. Yet he had learned in the provinces that survival required one gift rarer than courage: the ability to remain invisible until the storm passed. By the middle of the 1st century, Rome had grown weary of brilliance. It now prized endurance, and in that quality Vespasian excelled. His triumph in Britain had earned him distinction, but also suspicion. Emperors did not love successful generals. They tolerated them as long as distance allowed. Claudius, shrewd in his timidity, saw in Vespasian the kind of servant who could be trusted because he sought no glory. For that reason, and that reason only, he survived while others around him vanished into accusation and exile. His appointment as consul in 51 AD confirmed his reputation. The honor was ceremonial, a recognition of competence without intimacy. At the same table where flatterers fought for favor, Vespasian ate in silence, measuring the men around him. He understood the arithmetic of power. The more one spoke, the shorter one lived. Claudius' court was a labyrinth built by freedmen and guarded by his wife Agrippina, whose ambition blazed colder than steel. Her son Nero, still a youth, hovered at the emperor's side, smiling too often. The atmosphere was suffocating, a blend of fear and festivity, where every laugh could precede a death warrant. Vespasian endured it as he had endured every other hardship, by lowering his head and listening. He made no enemies, offered no opinions, and let his competence speak for him. When colleagues schemed for patronage, he withdrew to the outskirts of the Palatine, where he supervised grain deliveries and temple repairs. Agrippina's gaze, sharp as a spear, passed over him without interest. To be unnoticed in such a place was victory. When Claudius died, poisoned by his own household, the new emperor was Nero, and the air of calculation turned to farce. Youth, vanity, and flattery replaced order. Vespasian, now in his 40s, watched the transformation with dismay. Where Claudius had been cautious, Nero was theatrical. Where one ruled by delegation, the other ruled by whim. Senators learned to applaud poetry before policy, and generals who returned from war were expected to praise their ruler's lyre before reporting their victories. Vespasian, whose humor tended toward the dry, found this ritual absurd. His restraint soon made him conspicuous. He retreated from the capital, accepting an administrative posting in Africa, the sort of command that ruined the ambitious and rewarded the patient. The province was vast, wealthy, and temperamental. Grain shipments bound for Rome passed through its ports, and corruption had turned supply into famine. Local elites bribed officials, pirates disrupted trade, and Rome's own tax collectors bled the region dry. Vespasian arrived determined to repair what he could and endure what he must. He began by enforcing audits on merchants who had long believed themselves untouchable. Where others negotiated, he inspected. The great cities, Carthage, Leptis Magna, Hadrumetum, received him with guarded respect. He rebuilt aqueducts, restored order to the markets, and punished extortion with impersonal severity. His rule was neither gentle nor cruel. It was simply effective. To the wealthy, he was a nuisance. To the poor, a relief. The province stabilized, but its governor's frugality made him unpopular with everyone except his conscience. During a drought, when the people cried out for relief, he personally financed the import of grain from his own estates, ensuring that the city of Carthage remained fed. His colleagues mocked him for generosity unbecoming of a Roman senator. He answered that Rome had enough thieves in office and could survive one fool. Later, the locals would remember his stern face carved on their civic monuments, not in gratitude, but in respect. He left Africa poorer in fortune, but richer in reputation, an inversion that few politicians understood and none forgave. When his term ended, he returned quietly to Rome. The capital, under Nero, had changed beyond recognition. Palaces sprawled across the hills, theatres multiplied, and the emperor's name adorned everything from circuses to taverns. The treasury, once full, had become a shell. Nero's passions, music, chariot racing, and vanity had replaced policy. Vespasian, who valued substance over spectacle, found himself increasingly alienated from the emperor's court of actors and sycophants. The famous incident occurred soon after his return. Summoned to attend one of Nero's interminable performances in Greece, he sat among a weary audience of senators forced to feign ecstasy as their ruler sang. The heat, the incense, and the repetition overcame him. His head dropped. Nero saw it. A ripple of outrage followed. To fall asleep during the emperor's art was treason against divinity. Vespasian was dismissed from office and banished from sight. He returned again to the hills of Reate, where the air smelled of earth instead of perfume. There, far from intrigue, he lived as he always had, modestly, watching the seasons turn and the empire decay. His brother Sabinus, still in service as prefect of Rome, advised him to wait. Even emperors tire of music, he said. Vespasian smiled. Then Rome will sleep before I do. For 3 years, he remained in quiet exile. Yet patience, his oldest ally, once more proved its worth. By 66 AD, Nero's world was collapsing. The provinces of Gaul and Spain rebelled. The legions muttered, treason. In the east, Judea ignited in open revolt. A legion had been annihilated outside Jerusalem. Its eagles lost, its commander disgraced. The emperor needed an experienced soldier to crush the uprising. He looked down the long list of names and found only one that promised loyalty without glory. Vespasian's disgrace was suddenly forgotten. The summons arrived in the spring. Take command of the armies of the east, it read, and restore peace to our dominion. Vespasian accepted without ceremony. He knew the task would be brutal. The Jews were not an ordinary enemy. They fought with conviction sharper than steel. But obedience was his trade. Leaving Italy, he crossed the Aegean and entered Syria, where the governor, Mucianus, welcomed him with cautious deference. The legions stationed there, veterans of Armenia and Cappadocia, recognized in the new commander the same steady authority that had once guided them in Britain. Before marching south, he reorganized everything: pay records, supply chains, command hierarchies. He refused to fight until every deficiency was mended. Soldiers grumbled, but discipline returned. A general's first battle, he said, is with disorder. When he finally advanced into Judea, his army moved like an instrument tuned to precision. Through Galilee, he conducted a campaign of methodical destruction. Fortresses fell one by one. Resistance was broken with patience rather than fury. At Jotapata, he captured the historian Josephus, whose prophecy that Vespasian would rule the world became the strange echo of destiny. He dismissed it at the time, but the words lingered like a rumor from the gods. Each victory deepened his reputation, and with it, suspicion back in Rome. Nero's court began to whisper that the general in the east had grown too powerful. Others insisted he was the empire's last hope. Vespasian, as always, said nothing. He continued the siege, wrote brief, factual dispatches to the capital, and ignored the politics unraveling behind him. When Nero finally died by his own hand, the general received the news without expression. "So ends the actor," he said. The empire had entered its most perilous year, the year of the 4 emperors, and Vespasian, almost against his will, was about to become its last survivor. He did not yet know it, but the discipline learned in the courts of Claudius and the patience forged under Nero would soon become the foundation of his power. While Rome tore itself apart in the name of ambition, he would build an empire from the one virtue no other ruler possessed: endurance. For now, his legions marched south through the dust of Judea, their standards glinting in the sun. Behind them lay the ruins of rebellion. Before them, the uncertain road to destiny. The war in Judea was less a campaign than a crucible. Every fortress, every mile of desert, tested the patience that had become his signature. Vespasian knew that victory bought too quickly could not be kept. He advanced slowly, encircling resistance, cutting roads and rebuilding order as he moved. To his officers, it seemed caution. To him, it was arithmetic. Each town subdued without ruin became a future source of grain and tax. Rome's peace was built not by glory, but by ledger. At Caesarea, he set his headquarters, commanding the legions as an accountant might govern an empire. Messengers came daily with news from the west, rumors of Nero's death, then of Galba's triumph, then of Galba's murder. In the chaos that followed, he neither mourned nor rejoiced. He had seen too many emperors rise and fall to confuse their fates with the empire's. When his son Titus urged him to act, he answered, "A wise man waits until the gods have finished laughing." Patience served him well. Otho's suicide left Vitellius in control of Rome, a soldier emperor from the Rhine, whose loyalty to indulgence outstripped his loyalty to law. The legions in the east watched for Vespasian's signal. He gave none. "Our duty," he said, "is to the state, not to the noise in Rome." Yet even he could feel history shifting underfoot. When the governor of Egypt, Tiberius Alexander, pledged his legions to Vespasian, the decision was made for him. Control of Egypt meant control of the grain supply, and in that single act, the fate of Rome changed. Mucianus, governor of Syria and one of Vespasian's shrewdest allies, urged him to seize the moment. "Power cannot be refused twice," he wrote. Still, Vespasian hesitated. He was 60 years old, worn by wars and offices, skeptical of ambition. Yet reports from Italy described Vitellius parading through the streets in Nero's silks, his banquets devouring the treasury that was meant to feed the poor. Rome needed stability, not splendor. At last, Vespasian agreed. "If Rome must have a master," he said, "let it be one who remembers labor." In July of 69 AD, in the camp at Alexandria, his legions hailed him emperor. There was no crown, no chorus of trumpets, only the sound of soldiers beating their shields in assent. The muleteer of Reate had become the ruler of the world. His proclamation was practical rather than poetic. He promised bread, peace, and discipline. No more. It was enough. He spent the following months consolidating authority, sending letters to provincial governors, assuring them of continuity. His genius was not for conquest, but for structure. He understood that the empire did not need visionaries. It needed managers. While Mucianus and the Danubian legions marched westward to confront Vitellius, Vespasian remained in Egypt to secure the harvest. The decision baffled his officers until he explained, "An emperor who controls grain controls Rome. Let others win the glory. I will win breakfast." The campaign in Italy was brief and brutal. At Cremona, Vitellius's army was crushed. In Rome, his supporters barricaded the streets. By December, the city had fallen. Vitellius was dragged through the Forum and flung into the Tiber. When the Senate convened, trembling and eager to survive, it declared Vespasian emperor by acclamation. Far away in Alexandria, he received the news without ceremony. Those who expected exultation saw only calm. "We have work to do," he said. When he arrived in Rome, months later, the city still smelled of smoke. Temples lay in ruins, and the imperial treasury was empty. The people, exhausted by civil war, watched in silence as he entered, not in triumph, but on foot. No crown glittered on his head, no laurel around his neck. He bowed to the senators, thanked the gods, and began issuing orders. His first act was to rebuild what had been destroyed. His second, to tax what had survived. He reopened the courts, restored the grain supply, and dismissed corrupt administrators. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalties had shifted with every emperor, was restructured under new leadership. He purged no one out of vengeance, but removed anyone too clever for honesty. The same steadiness that had marked him as a soldier now defined him as ruler. He had learned long ago that the surest way to end a crisis was not to feed it. In the palace, once owned by Nero, he refused to live. The vast halls of the Golden House were stripped of jewels, their fountains drained, their bronze doors melted into coin. On that ground, he planned something different. A monument not to indulgence, but to endurance. It would be a public amphitheater, a gift to the people built from the spoils of war. Years later, it would be known as the Colosseum, but in his time, it was simply the answer to decadence. Stone where there had been gold, laughter where there had been silence. The Senate, at first skeptical of the provincial on the throne, found in him a ruler who treated them as partners rather than ornaments. He restored their dignity while quietly ensuring they posed no threat. Their debates resumed, their relevance not quite. He used them as Rome had always used its symbols, to keep appearances alive while reality was governed elsewhere. Even his enemies admitted that the empire ran more smoothly under his practical hand than under any philosopher's vision. As his reign settled, so did his humor. Once, when courtiers complained that his taxes on public latrines demeaned the dignity of Rome, he lifted a coin from the revenue and asked, "Does it smell?" They shook their heads. "Then Rome is clean." The phrase pecunia non olet, money does not smell, summed up his philosophy. If something kept the empire solvent, it was virtuous enough. Behind the jest was principle. He had no patience for pretense. His palace meals were simple, his entertainments rare. When senators arrived dripping in jewels, he greeted them in a wool cloak. When poets recited praise, he paid them promptly, but reminded them that flattery was not currency. The people loved his bluntness. He was a man they understood, neither divine nor untouchable, but one who had clawed his way upward and still counted expenses. Yet stability demanded more than thrift. Beyond the capital, the provinces required repair. Roads destroyed in the civil wars were rebuilt, garrisons resupplied, trade revived. He sent engineers to Spain and Africa, administrators to Asia, and surveyors across the frontiers. For the first time in decades, the empire functioned as one machine rather than a dozen competing engines. Each success reinforced his authority. Each tax funded another restoration. In all of it, Vespasian avoided the fatal disease of emperors, vanity. He governed as if time was short, measuring every project against his mortality. When courtiers suggested statues, he ordered them built of bronze, not gold. When asked why, he replied, "So they can melt them down when the next man needs money." He neither courted affection nor feared contempt. His rule was an argument for competence itself. Within his household, he prepared for continuity. Titus, the elder son, had proven himself in Judea, commanding with charm and discipline. Domitian, the younger, chafed at his secondary role. Vespasian divided honors carefully, aware that dynasties collapse first in the family. His evenings were spent not in feasts, but in discussions with architects, scribes, and soldiers. He trusted systems, not heirs. Let them inherit structure, he said, not chaos. By the 3rd year of his reign, Rome had regained its breath. The markets thrived, the legions were paid, and the treasury held silver again. Peace, once a rumor, became habit. Those who had expected the muleteer to rule crudely now admitted that his rough hands steadied the state. The empire had traded spectacle for solidity. It was a fair bargain. He never forgot the lessons of the court he had survived. Claudius had taught him caution. Agrippina, the cost of proximity to power. Nero, the absurdity of self-worship. Each had been a teacher in the art of endurance. From them, he learned that the greatest strength of an emperor was to appear ordinary and to make that ordinariness divine. Toward the end of his life, when asked how he wished to be remembered, he answered with the same economy that had governed his rule, as a man who worked. No poet could improve it. The war in Judea began as a spark and became a storm. No other province of the empire had defied Rome with such defiant purpose. No other revolt was so personal to the gods. To the Jews, rebellion was not treason, but purification. To Rome, it was contagion. When Vespasian received command in 66 AD, he understood that this would not be a campaign of conquest, but of endurance, a test of whether discipline could outlast faith. He arrived by sea at Ptolemais with 2 legions, joined by a 3rd from Syria, bringing his total to nearly 60,000 men. An army designed not to win glory, but to restore order. He was 57, his hair already grey, his patience long perfected. In the east, among the heat and dust, he moved like a craftsman among wreckage. Every order he gave was precise, every delay intentional. A slow victory, he said, is better than a quick defeat. The enemy he faced was unlike any he had met before. The Jews fought not for an emperor or territory, but for a vision of purity that Rome could neither match nor destroy. They believed their temple indestructible, their covenant eternal, and their suffering a badge of holiness. Vespasian had no contempt for such belief, only understanding. A people with nothing to lose, he told his officers, cannot be conquered, only managed. And so he chose to manage them by isolation. From his base in Caesarea, he advanced north into Galilee, the region where rebellion burned brightest. Villages clung to ridges, walled and stubborn, their defenders ready to die rather than yield. Vespasian's son Titus commanded a division under him, learning by example the rhythm of Roman war: advance, surround, build, wait. The elder general never fought the terrain. He shaped it. Engineers followed his columns like shadows, measuring slopes, digging trenches, and raising siege ramps that turned mountains into weapons. The first great test came at Jotapata, a city perched on a high hill and defended by zeal and stone. For 40 days the Romans encircled it. Archers rained death by day, catapults hurled stones by night. Each dawn, the defenders rebuilt what the previous dusk had destroyed. Vespasian admired their tenacity, even as he prepared their ruin. When the final assault came, it was not fury, but inevitability that won. The walls fell, the city burned, and its leader, Josephus, scholar, priest, and general, was taken alive. Brought before the Roman commander, Josephus prophesied that Vespasian would one day rule the world. The claims sounded absurd amid the smoke of a conquered city, but the general did not dismiss him. He neither believed nor disbelieved. He simply kept the man alive. Every story needs a witness, he said. That decision would later echo across history. As Galilee fell, other cities surrendered without resistance. The legions advanced through scorched valleys, leaving behind silence and the faint smell of limestone dust. Each victory added not triumph, but burden. For every fortress captured, 2 more rebels took to the hills. The war had no center, no conclusion, only the steady rhythm of suppression. Yet within that rhythm, Vespasian's reputation hardened into legend. Soldiers began calling him Imperator, a title of respect rather than office. When he walked through the camps, men straightened their armor instinctively. They trusted him not because he promised victory, but because he never lied about cost. He ruled the army as he would later rule the empire, by making structure itself his ally. Punishment was measured, reward predictable. Even in war, he kept the accounts of rations, ensured supply chains, and demanded that looted goods be catalogued. Chaos was the one enemy he never forgave. To the Jewish prisoners, he showed the same pragmatic restraint. Those who resisted were executed. Those who surrendered were fed and sent to rebuild Roman roads. Conquest, to him, was never complete until order was restored. Through the summer of 67 AD, the campaign spread southward. His son Titus marched ahead to subdue the coastal plain, while Vespasian swept through the inland valleys. By autumn, the northern rebellion was broken. At Sepphoris, the gates opened without a fight. At Tiberias, the citizens offered tribute and begged for mercy. He granted it, not out of pity, but prudence. "Let them live," he said, "for dead men pay no taxes." The general's reports to Rome were brief and precise, devoid of rhetoric. Nero read them with approval, mistaking discipline for devotion. In truth, Vespasian's loyalty was to the empire, not to the man who governed it. As the war quieted in the north, he turned his attention to the broader problem of Judea itself. Jerusalem remained defiant, the center of resistance and faith. To attack it directly would invite disaster. He chose instead to strangle it slowly, cutting its trade routes, isolating its allies, and letting starvation do what siege engines could not. While he prepared for that final campaign, word reached him that Nero had embarked on another of his grand tours, performing music in Greece while the empire decayed. Reports of rebellion in Gaul and Spain arrived almost daily. The general knew what such tremors meant. The center was cracking. For now, he continued his work, though the horizon darkened. "The empire," he told Titus, "is like this land, fertile but brittle. One careless harvest, and it crumbles." When news of Nero's death reached Caesarea in 68 AD, the camp fell silent. Soldiers gathered in knots, wondering who would rule them next. Galba had already been proclaimed emperor in Spain, but few knew his name. Vespasian ordered a day of mourning, neither celebrating nor condemning. To his officers he said only, "An emperor is dead. The empire remains." It was an answer so calm that some mistook it for indifference. In truth, it was calculation. He had learned through decades of service that Rome's greatest danger was not rebellion abroad, but chaos within. Through that uncertain year, he waited. Orders from Rome arrived and contradicted one another. Galba's authority evaporated in the capital before it reached the provinces. Then came Otho, then Vitellius. The empire became a carousel of claimants, each spinning faster than the last. Vespasian observed, as he once had at Claudius's court, that the loudest men often burned first. Let them consume each other, he told Mucianus, the governor of Syria. We will inherit the ashes. Yet history was already aligning with him. Egypt's legions declared for his cause, followed by Syria and Asia. Mucianus, a man of refined cunning, urged immediate action. Rome, he said, is a body without a head. Be the head. Still, Vespasian hesitated. He would not seize what was not offered. Only when his soldiers demanded to swear loyalty did he accept. Even then, he framed his decision as necessity, not ambition. If Rome must have another master, let it be one who remembers work. As he gathered his forces, the difference between him and the men who had ruled before became clear. Galba had been austere, Otho desperate, Vitellius corrupt. Vespasian was simply competent. His legitimacy grew not from prophecy or bloodline, but from the memory of order. The legions in the east, weary of chaos, saw in him a man who could repair what others had ruined. They proclaimed him emperor in July 69, not with cheers, but with relief. Still, he did not march on Rome. Instead, he stayed in Egypt to secure the grain fleet, knowing that starvation would conquer where swords might fail. He wrote to Mucianus, "Feed the people, and they will call you just. Starve them, and they will call you divine." His mind was already turning from battle to administration, from generalship to governance. When Vitellius finally fell, the Senate, desperate for stability, ratified what the legions had already decided. Across the empire, temples offered sacrifice to the new emperor. In the deserts of Judea, the last embers of rebellion flickered under Titus's command. The war that had made the father would now finish the son. Vespasian's journey from provincial soldier to ruler of the world had taken 6 decades and countless miles. Yet in his own eyes, nothing essential had changed. "I am still a worker," he told a companion. "Only the tools are different." He had built his empire on the same principles that had guided every road, fort, and aqueduct: measure, patience, and stone that did not crack. Now the stones of Judea lay in ruin, and from their dust rose the Flavian age. The general had fulfilled his prophecy, whether he believed it or not. But destiny, like empire, was never finished. There were still cities to rebuild, debts to count, and a world to convince that order had truly returned. When the war's fury reached its height, the empire itself was beginning to fracture. Nero's death had thrown Rome into anarchy, but in the east, Vespasian maintained what the capital could not: discipline. While others fought for titles, he fought to keep the system breathing. His camp became a miniature empire. The forges smoked, the roads were repaired daily, and supply convoys crossed the desert as predictably as sunrise. In the middle of confusion, he created order, and that steadiness began to shine more brightly than any imperial crown. Through 68 and early 69 AD, the legions of Syria and Egypt waited for his word. The East was watching, and the man they watched was not a statesman or a dreamer, but a soldier who kept accounts in his head. His officers understood his caution. "It is not enough to win a war," he told them. "We must deserve peace afterward." By then, the prophecy, spoken by Josephus at Jotapata, of Vespasian's future rule, had taken on the weight of inevitability. Soldiers whispered it by the fires. Even his enemies began to believe it, as if destiny had already chosen him. But destiny alone never built an empire. While Galba and Otho fought their brief, bloody duels for the throne, Vespasian wrote to Mucianus, his ally in Syria, setting out the first outlines of a new regime. Secure the grain from Egypt, guard the sea routes, and wait until Rome begged for rescue. It was strategy at its most merciless, war by patience. When Mucianus urged him to act before Vitellius could consolidate power, Vespasian replied, "A good hunter does not chase a wounded beast into the thicket." The wound widened. In Alexandria, the governor, Tiberius Alexander, took the first step that changed everything. On the first day of July, before dawn, he gathered his legions and proclaimed Vespasian emperor. The soldiers shouted his name, priests sacrificed to Fortuna. The port cities along the Nile erupted in celebration. When the message reached Caesarea, Vespasian remained calm. He read it twice, set the tablet down, and said, "So, the gods insist." That night, his legions swore allegiance. It was not a moment of triumph, only of transition, the burden shifting from one man's shoulders to his. He moved cautiously, leaving the command in Judea to his son Titus, and the political maneuvering in Italy to Mucianus. His task was the lifeblood of the empire, grain. Without it, even victory in Rome would be useless. For weeks he rode between harbors, inspecting ships, counting cargo, verifying weights. His officers found the work tedious. He called it survival. Empires starve faster than they fall, he reminded them. Meanwhile, Rome consumed itself. The Danubian legions, weary of Vitellius's corruption, turned against him. Civil war tore through the Po Valley. Cremona burned. The capital became a battleground between praetorians and civilians. By December, Vitellius was dead, dragged through the Forum and hurled into the Tiber. The Senate declared Vespasian emperor. He accepted the news in Egypt, standing among amphorae of grain. His only remark was practical: see that the ships sail on time. When he finally crossed into Italy months later, the empire he entered was barely recognizable. Palaces looted, temples blackened, the treasury empty. Rome resembled a battlefield disguised in marble. The people expected another tyrant. Instead, they saw a weary soldier. He entered the city not in armor, but in a simple cloak, walking beside his sons. There was no triumphal procession, no spectacle, only a promise unspoken. The years of chaos were over. From the first days of his rule, he governed as if empire were a matter of logistics, not miracles. The Senate was summoned, its dignity restored. The Praetorian Guard was restructured, loyalists rewarded, opportunists dismissed. Taxes were overhauled, provincial governors audited, and the gold stripped from Nero's palaces melted into coin. He treated the empire as a household to be cleaned after a riot. No anger, no pity, just work. His philosophy was simple: order is wealth. Rome must earn before she spends, he said, and he led by example. His own table was plain, his clothing unadorned. He sold imperial estates that served no purpose, abolished needless ceremonies, and revived old laws that demanded accountability from every level of government. Senators complained that he treated them like clerks. He answered, better clerks than courtiers. The jest concealed a truth. He was turning a ruin back into a machine. The people responded with gratitude, not enthusiasm. They did not adore him. They trusted him. After the delirium of Nero and the decadence of Vitellius, a ruler who spoke less than he worked was a novelty. He walked the streets without escort, spoke to merchants in their stalls, and laughed at his own expense. One day, when a beggar shouted that emperors should share their riches, he tossed the man a coin and said, "Now we share the debt as well." Yet even amid reconstruction, the war in Judea demanded closure. Titus, leading the final assault on Jerusalem, sent dispatches describing both victory and horror. When the city fell in 70 AD, its temple burned and its treasures carried to Rome. Vespasian saw in the ashes not glory, but caution. Every triumph, he said, is another debt to the gods. He celebrated the victory publicly, but privately called it a tragedy, the inevitable cost of keeping order in a world that no longer believed in restraint. The spoils of the Jewish war became the cornerstone of his rebuilding. The gold and artifacts from Jerusalem funded the empire's revival. New temples, restored aqueducts, and a vast amphitheatre on the site of Nero's pleasure lake. It was to be a monument to endurance, not excess. He called it the Flavian Amphitheatre. Posterity named it the Colosseum. It rose from the ground like a correction to history, built with the wealth of rebellion to entertain the peace it had purchased. As the city transformed, so did the empire's mood. The provinces, long neglected, found new attention. Roads were repaired across Spain and Gaul. Frontiers along the Rhine strengthened. Trade revived in Africa. The chaos of the previous decade faded into memory. Even senators who had once mocked his origins began to admit that the mule breeder's son had accomplished what nobles could not. He had made Rome practical again. But success came with shadows. Within his household, the balance between his sons grew uneasy. Titus was steady and loyal, Domitian restless and proud. Vespasian managed them as he managed the empire, with measured distance. He knew that dynasties did not fail from weakness, but from comfort. Work, he told them, is the only inheritance that survives. They smiled, but he could see in their eyes the impatience of youth that empire never forgives. His relationship with Titus was one of mutual respect. The father saw in the son the same steadiness that had carried him from Riete to Rome. When Titus entered the city in triumph after the fall of Jerusalem, Vespasian watched from the rostrum, expressionless. The crowds cheered for the heir who had avenged the empire's insult, but the father saw something more fragile, the beginning of complacency. That night he told him, "Remember that glory feeds itself, not others." Titus understood. Domitian did not. Beyond family and politics, the years that followed were years of consolidation. Vespasian revived the old republican forms without pretending to restore the republic itself. He allowed debate, tolerated criticism, even laughter at his expense, believing that humor kept fear from breeding treason. Poets and historians flourished under his cautious generosity. He read their verses, paid their stipends, and reminded them that history should serve truth, not vanity. It was his final lesson to the empire, that honesty, though less spectacular than ambition, was more enduring. By the close of the decade, the Flavian peace had become a fact. The roads hummed with trade, the treasury overflowed, and the legions on every frontier swore loyalty without hesitation. For the first time since Augustus, the empire felt whole. Vespasian, the provincial who had learned empire from its edges, had achieved what bloodlines and philosophers could not, a working Rome. He ruled without illusion. He knew peace was a pause, not a promise. The gods lend stability, he once said, but they never sell it. Still, he built as if it might last forever. The Colosseum rose stone by stone, a monument to labor itself, each block a testament to the muleteer who had carried Rome out of the mud. When visitors praised its grandeur, he waved them off. "It will stand until the people grow idle again," he said. He understood that buildings, like empires, could not endure longer than the virtues that raised them, and as long as he lived, he would not let those virtues decay. It began with silence. No orders, no air, only the faint echo of a dying man's last words. Nero's suicide in June of 68 AD ended a dynasty and left the world without a center. For the first time in a century, Rome was leaderless. The empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. yet its power trembled on the blade of uncertainty. In the absence of an emperor, generals remembered their ambitions, governors remembered their legions, and each province began to dream of a crown. The year that followed would see 4 emperors rise and fall before Rome remembered the meaning of stability. Vespasian was in Caesarea when the news reached him. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and continued his inspection of the camp. To the officers waiting for direction, he offered none. "Rome has survived worse than its rulers," he said. Those who served under him understood what that meant. Patience first, action later. While others rushed to declare allegiance, he watched the chaos unfold with the cold eye of a man who had seen too many storms to mistake thunder for destiny. In Spain, Servius Galba seized the moment. Old, stern, and miserly, he proclaimed himself emperor in the name of the Senate. His legions marched toward Italy, and the Praetorian Guard, smelling opportunity, betrayed Nero. Galba entered Rome in triumph, only to discover that governing a world required more than age and austerity. He refused the customary bribes, dismissed soldiers who expected rewards, and insulted allies who expected gratitude. His rule lasted 7 months. Across the empire, faith in Galba evaporated like water in desert heat. In the east, Vespasian continued his campaign, content to let others tear the capital apart. In his tent at night, he marked each emperor's name in a ledger, as if recording debts. When Galba's successor, Otho, rose by murder, Vespasian noted the date but did not move his armies. He understood that the legions in Germany, fierce and proud, would never accept a usurper from the capital. They did not. The Rhine legions proclaimed their own emperor, Aulus Vitellius, a man of appetite and vanity. His soldiers marched south, leaving chaos in their wake. Otho met them at Bedriacum and was defeated. Rather than flee, he took his own life, a gesture of dignity rare in a year of opportunists. Vitellius entered Rome amid drunken celebrations, promising peace, delivering disorder. From the east, the empire's provinces watched the spectacle with weary contempt. Syria and Egypt, responsible for feeding the capital, refused to send grain until a ruler worthy of loyalty emerged. Mucianus, the governor of Syria, wrote to Vespasian daily. "The city devours itself," he warned. "We can either feed it or bury it." Still, the general hesitated. He had never sought power and distrusted those who did. Yet his soldiers, hardened by years of war, began to murmur that the empire needed a man who could govern as he commanded, by reason rather than rage. The decisive moment came not from ambition, but from necessity. Egypt controlled the flow of grain to Rome. Without it, the city would starve. The prefect of Egypt, Tiberius Alexander, seeing both opportunity and desperation, acted on his own. At dawn on the first day of July, 69 AD, he gathered his legions in Alexandria and hailed Vespasian as emperor. The news spread like a signal through the eastern provinces. By nightfall, Syria, Judea, and the Danubian armies had joined the cause. When messengers brought the proclamation to Caesarea, Vespasian read it in silence. He did not smile. "If the gods insist," he said, "then let us pray they are serious." His officers cheered. He remained still. The weight of empire had fallen on his shoulders again, this time not as a soldier's duty, but as a ruler's burden. He accepted power in the only way he knew, practically. There were no speeches, no promises of divine favor. Instead, he called for a map of the grain routes, calculating how long Rome could survive before famine forced Vitellius from the throne. "Starvation," he said, "is faster than the sword." The plan was simple: secure Egypt's harvest, cut the flow to the capital, and let the city decide which emperor it preferred to feed. While Mucianus led an army westward through Asia Minor to confront Vitellius, Vespasian remained in Egypt, ensuring that every ship left its port on time. He trusted logistics more than luck. His allies across the empire began to declare for him, governors, legions, and provincial cities eager for order. In the space of weeks, his name traveled from the Nile to the Alps. The world had found a ruler before he had decided to become one. In Rome, Vitellius reacted with the panic of a man who had mistaken gluttony for power. He tried to bribe loyalty back into existence, but silver could not buy soldiers who had not been paid in months. Civil war returned to the streets. When Mucianus's generals, among them Antonius Primus, defeated Vitellius's forces at Cremona, the road to Rome lay open. The city, swollen with fear, waited for the next name to carve on its monuments. Vespasian, still in Egypt, showed no excitement. His counselors urged him to sail at once and claim his prize. He refused. "I will not rule a city in flames," he said. Instead, he sent letters promising clemency to Vitellius's supporters and grain to the people. His rule began not with conquest, but with supply. In December, his troops entered the capital. Vitellius was dragged from his palace, beaten to death, and thrown into the Tiber. The Senate, trembling and exhausted, proclaimed Vespasian emperor. He received the news at Alexandria, surrounded by merchants and soldiers. There were no trumpets, no applause, only his quiet nod. "Then let us begin." With those words, the empire's first true administrator ascended the throne. He had survived Nero's theatre, Claudius's intrigue, Caligula's madness, and the bloodbath of 69 AD. The year of the four emperors ended as it began, with Rome in ruin. But this time, the man who would rebuild it stood ready. His first act was to restore the army's faith. He ordered back pay for all legions, repairs for damaged camps, and strict accounting for future expenses. Loyalty, he knew, was built not on oaths, but on reliability. His second act was to reopen the channels of food and trade. Within months, ships from Alexandria filled the harbours of Ostia again. Bread returned to the markets, and the crowd's anger turned to cautious gratitude. The Senate, which had bent under every wind of the past year, found in him a ruler who neither flattered nor threatened. He summoned its members to deliberate on taxation and rebuilding, making them feel useful even as he quietly made them irrelevant. "Let them think they govern," he told Mucianus. "They will obey better." In the provinces, news of stability spread like rainfall on scorched earth. Governors who had gambled on Vitellius hastened to profess loyalty. Vespasian accepted them all, forgiving quickly, forgetting nothing. "Mercy," he said, "is cheaper than revenge." The empire had rediscovered a virtue rarer than courage: pragmatism. By the year's end, the roads were safe again, the legions fed, and the treasury receiving coin instead of excuses. For the first time since Augustus, the state felt functional. But Vespasian knew how fragile such order was. He had seen Rome's disease, the addiction to spectacle, the worship of personality. "They want gods," he told his advisors. "I will give them an accountant." So began the Flavian Age, not with ceremony, but with work. The empire had bled for a year to remember that it needed structure more than dreams. And in the man from the Sabine hills, the muleteer who had carried burdens all his life, it found exactly that. When his generals congratulated him, he replied dryly, "We have survived the gods' comedy. Now let us see if we can survive ourselves." The laughter that followed was weary, but it was laughter all the same. the first Rome had heard in a very long time. The city that greeted him was not the Rome of marble poets described, but one of ash and fatigue. Streets still stank of corpses, temples stood roofless, and the Senate house bore scorch marks from Vitellius' last defense. What Nero's vanity had not squandered, civil war had devoured. Vespasian stepped onto that broken stage without triumph. To him, the empire was not a theatre to inherit, but a workshop to repair. "The play is over," he told his aides. "Now begins the labor." He entered the capital without ceremony, dressed not in imperial purple, but in a soldier's cloak dusted from travel. Crowds lined the streets, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. The empire's newest ruler was neither handsome nor heroic. Stocky, stooped from years in armor, his expression more craftsman than conqueror. Yet in that plainness, Rome recognized something it had forgotten: normality. Vitellius had left the treasury empty, the granaries plundered, and the legions unpaid. The first act of the new reign was survival. Vespasian ordered a census of wealth and debt, reopening every imperial ledger. He taxed trade, revived customs on luxury imports, and demanded restitution from officials who had fattened themselves on corruption. To fund reconstruction, he even sold imperial furniture and jewels once belonging to Nero's golden palace. When senators protested that such measures were beneath imperial dignity, he replied, "Better an emperor who counts coins than one who burns them." Money became morality. He imposed levies on baths, taverns, and brothels, anything that produced profit. When Titus, his elder son, objected to a tax on public latrinas as unworthy of Rome, Vespasian lifted a coin from the revenue and asked if it smelled. "No," he said, "then it is clean." The jest would survive him as his philosophy in miniature, practicality above pride. With the coffers refilled, he turned to the army. Soldiers, unpaid and restless, had made and unmade 4 emperors. Vespasian restored the oath of loyalty to the state rather than the person, restructured pay schedules, and rotated legions to break regional loyalties. He rewarded discipline, not flattery, ensuring that merit rose faster than intrigue. "An empire," he said, "cannot stand if its armies salute men instead of laws." Discipline soon extended to the provinces. He dispatched trusted administrators to Gaul, Spain, and Africa, instructing them to rebuild roads and aqueducts before statues and theatres. Governors accustomed to bribes found themselves audited, sometimes executed, but often simply replaced by obscure men of competence. The empire began to run as he had once run a legion, slowly, efficiently, without drama. At home, his authority grew from silence. The people, numbed by a decade of excess, found comfort in his lack of spectacle. He revived the grain dole, repaired the aqueducts, and funded public works that gave citizens both wages and pride. Even his humor, dry, provincial, practical, became legend. When a courtier complained that his shoes smelled of leather rather than perfume, he replied, "At least they fit." It was the sort of jest that turned distance into affection. But Vespasian understood that order required more than bread and jokes. It required symbols. Nero had turned the heart of Rome into a private garden, his golden house spreading over the Palatine like an infection of marble. The new emperor ordered it demolished. On its drained lake, he planned something for the people, not the palace, a vast amphitheater to host games and festivals. Built with spoils from the Jewish war, it would stand where the empire's shame had stood, its stones laid by freedmen and soldiers alike. He named it the Flavian Amphitheater. History called it the Colosseum. Its construction became a metaphor for his rule, stone replacing gold, utility replacing vanity. When courtiers asked why he spent so much on public works rather than palaces, he answered, "Because stones do not flatter, and they last longer." The Senate, long humiliated by emperors who treated it as ornament, found itself both respected and controlled. Vespasian invited senators to debate taxes and provincial administration, listening patiently before deciding alone. Their pride revived even as their power waned. "Let them speak," he said to Mucianus. "It costs nothing, and they leave happier." The illusion of partnership was one of his subtlest reforms. By allowing the old forms of the Republic to survive, he diffused nostalgia for its return. Meanwhile, the empire's frontiers demanded attention. In the north, the Batavian revolt had shaken confidence in Roman rule. In the east, Parthia tested boundaries once more. Vespasian reorganized defenses, building new forts along the Rhine and Danube, and standardizing command structures that would outlast him. His reign's genius was not conquest, but consolidation. "Better a wall that stands," he told the Senate, "than a frontier that bleeds." His sons were part of this reconstruction. Titus, already famous for Jerusalem's fall, became his right hand in government. Domitian, restless and proud, was kept in ceremonial roles to prevent mischief. To outsiders, the Flavian household looked harmonious. Within, ambition flickered like a pilot flame. Vespasian, who had spent a lifetime studying men, saw it clearly but refused to intervene. "They must learn what peace costs," he said. He knew that dynasties, like empires, survived only when heirs learned restraint. As stability returned, so did culture. Poets who had hidden during Nero's reign emerged cautiously, and historians began to record again without trembling. Vespasian patronized them all, but without vanity. When the philosopher Musonius Rufus lectured that emperors should live like sages, he replied, "And sages should try governing before they advise." Yet he funded libraries, paid teachers, and restored academies closed by neglect. Knowledge, he believed, was cheaper than war and lasted longer than monuments. The years following his accession brought an unfamiliar feeling to the empire: predictability. The market stabilized, the coinage regained value, and trade resumed between East and West. Cities ruined by the civil wars were rebuilt. The population, long accustomed to terror, began to plan for the future again. The peace that emerged was not the radiant calm of Augustus, but the durable quiet of exhaustion well managed. Still, the emperor never confused quiet with permanence. In the evenings, walking the gardens of his modest house on the Quirinal Hill, he would say to his aides, "Rome always wakes hungry." He meant not only for food, but for drama, for gods, for indulgence. His task, as he saw it, was to keep the appetite fed, but not inflamed. It was the philosophy of a farmer tending an empire that had forgotten how to sow. His private life mirrored his public simplicity. After Domitilla's death, he lived with Cenice, a woman who had once served as secretary to Antonia, mother of Claudius. She was intelligent, loyal, and unpretentious, a companion chosen for company, not display. The union, unofficial by law, scandalized the nobles, who whispered about propriety. Vespasian laughed them off. "It is easier," he said, "to share a bed with one honest woman than a senate full of them." Such humor disarmed his critics, but it also masked the fatigue of a man who had spent his life cleaning up after others. He rose before dawn each day, dictated correspondence, heard petitions, inspected accounts, and reviewed building progress. His handwriting, rough and uneven, covered thousands of pages of imperial orders. Even his secretaries complained that he never stopped working. "An emperor," he he told them, dies the moment he delegates his conscience. Under his steady hand, the empire learned once again the rhythm of administration. Collect, record, repair, repeat. The chaos of the past years faded into parable. Nero became a warning. Vitellius, a joke. The new generation of Romans grew up believing that Vespasian had saved the world by thrift alone. It was half true. What he truly restored was trust. After a century in which emperors had promised divinity and delivered ruin, a man who made roads instead of miracles seemed miraculous enough. Rome did not love him as it had loved Augustus, or fear him as it had feared Nero. It respected him. That, for Vespasian, was victory. One evening, watching the amphitheater's rising arches catch the sunset, he said quietly to Titus, "We have built this with rebellion's gold. Remember that peace is always paid for by someone else." His son nodded, but the father kept his gaze on the horizon. He knew peace was never final, only maintained. The year of the 4 emperors had ended with his triumph, but triumph was a word he distrusted. What he had won was not glory, but time, the breathing space in which Rome might learn again to function. And for a man who had spent his life mending what others had broken, time was the only empire worth ruling. Morning over the Palatine was quiet again. For the first time in a decade, Rome woke not to rumor or revolt, but to the sound of hammers and the rhythm of rebuilding. Beneath the scaffolds of temples and aqueducts, workers shouted measurements instead of oaths, and merchants in the forum spoke of contracts rather than conspiracies. The empire had rediscovered its pulse. Vespasian, now firmly emperor, began each day, as he always had, by counting. Grain shipments from Alexandria, revenue from taxes, expenditures on the army. Numbers were his prayers, order his creed. The city he ruled was a ruin dressed in ceremony. Nero's golden house had drained the treasury and scorched the dignity of the capital. Vitellius' soldiers had defiled what was left. Vespasian walked through its corridors soon after his return. Marble floors cracked, ceilings blackened by smoke, and ordered everything of value melted down. Rome must live in light again, he said. From its wreckage would rise housing for citizens, markets for trade, and in time the great amphitheater that would carry his family's name. Where decadence had ruled, labor would reign. His reforms began with the treasury. Years of indulgence and civil war had left the empire bankrupt. He treated it as he had once treated a disordered legion, by rebuilding the ranks. Taxes were recalculated, provincial revenues audited, and monopolies scrutinized. He introduced new duties on luxury goods and reinstated old ones on trade. Even urine collected from public latrines, used by fullers to wash cloth, became taxable. "Money has no smell," he said when critics sneered, and the phrase spread through the markets like a proverb. For him, thrift was not meanness, but justice. Gold spent on vanity was theft from soldiers and citizens alike. When courtiers mocked his economy, he reminded them that an emperor's extravagance was always paid for in someone else's hunger. "A ruler who loves perfume," he quipped, "will soon learn the scent of debt." Each jest was a policy in disguise. The army came next. The legions that had survived the year of the 4 emperors were proud, bitter, and dangerously politicized. Vespasian reorganized their command structure, reassigned officers loyal to Vitellius, and standardized promotions based on merit rather than favor. He visited the camps himself, inspecting barracks, questioning supply officers, and dining with centurions. Soldiers expected grandeur. They found a man who ate the same bread they did. In return, he gained the one loyalty that outlasted flattery: trust. His discipline extended to the Praetorian Guard, that nest of conspirators who had sold and slain emperors for a century. He disbanded them, purged the worst offenders, and rebuilt the corps under new leadership, smaller and under closer supervision. The Guard, he told Mucianus, should guard the emperor, not choose him. By removing their power to make history, he ensured they would finally protect it. In administration, he practiced a patient ruthlessness. Provincial governors were recalled and examined, their books scrutinized for embezzlement. He rewarded honest service with security, dishonesty with exile. Yet he preferred correction to bloodshed. An empire, he said, cannot be ruled through executions. They are too expensive. His methods worked. Within a year, the treasury overflowed again. Roads long neglected were repaired. Harbors reopened. Trade revived from Spain to Syria. Taxes funded not palaces, but infrastructure. Bridges, aqueducts, and drainage works that gave the people visible proof of government. Rome began to look less like a monument to decadence and more like a working city. But rebuilding was not only a matter of stone and silver. The empire's morale was fractured, its confidence eroded by decades of madness. Vespasian restored faith not through rhetoric, but by example. He appeared in public constantly, at markets, temples, and theaters, moving among citizens without guards. When supplicants knelt before him, he lifted them up, saying, "I am only taller because the gods need someone to see the dust." Such gestures, small but constant, redefined majesty as accessibility. He refused the cult of divinity that had turned emperors into idols. When priests proposed new temples in his name, he laughed. "Build them to useful gods," he said, "like reason or discipline. I am not immortal, only busy." It was the first time in memory that humility sounded imperial. His rule was guided less by vision than by repair. He did not dream of new conquests. He dreamt of an empire that worked. Yet that pragmatism, mistaken by some for mediocrity, proved revolutionary. The machinery of government, rusted by vanity, began to turn again. The Senate, though stripped of real power, was treated with respect. The provinces, once bled dry, saw governors who kept accounts instead of harems. He restored the sense that the state, if not fair, was at least functioning. Still, his austerity had limits. He understood that people could not live on stability alone. Festivals returned to the calendar, games to the amphitheaters. He encouraged laughter as a civic virtue. Better, he said, that Rome laugh at its rulers than fear them. The public adored his humor, which was plain and biting. Once, when an astrologer predicted that the emperor's successor would surpass him, Vespasian replied, "That will please me if he remembers who paid his salary." Behind the jest was calculation. By drawing the people into his jokes, he drew them into his rule. His laughter made them accomplices in order. The Flavian peace, as later historians would call it, was not peace by awe, but peace by agreement. Beyond the city, the provinces responded in kind. In Gaul, where rebellion had flared under Nero, new cities rose under his patronage. In Africa, he expanded grain production, ensuring Rome's bread supply for decades. In the East, he confirmed the loyalty of client kings through respect rather than intimidation. An emperor cannot be everywhere, he told his advisors, but he can be reasonable. Reason proved a better weapon than terror. Meanwhile, Titus completed the final phase of the Jewish war. The siege of Jerusalem ended in destruction. The temple burned, and the spoils filled Rome's coffers. When the triumphant son returned, Vespasian greeted him not as a conqueror, but as a colleague. Together they paraded through the city, carrying the golden menorah and sacred vessels of the temple. To the crowd, it was spectacle. To the father, it was closure. The rebellion that had forged his power had also tested his restraint. He ordered the captives sold, but forbade unnecessary cruelty. Let the memory of victory feed Rome, he said, not its appetite. In the months that followed, the empire began to resemble the ideal Augustus had once imagined. Secure borders, loyal provinces, and a bureaucracy that served continuity rather than personality. Yet where Augustus had ruled by grandeur, Vespasian ruled by repair. His monuments were not only stone, but systems. He made stability visible. Still, his reign was not without unease. The Senate, though grateful for restoration, resented his simplicity. Nobles mocked his manners, whispering that the empire smelled of mules and sweat. Vespasian answered their insults with laughter and appointments. If they envy me, he said, let them work as I do. His humor, like his taxes, was a way of redistributing power. By the 5th year of his rule, Rome had grown accustomed to peace. The scars of civil war faded beneath new marble, and the citizens began to believe again in permanence. Yet Vespasian, who had seen too much of human fortune, trusted nothing that came easily. He continued to rise before dawn, still reviewing ledgers himself, still inspecting construction sites. An emperor, he said, must die in debt to the day. And though the empire flourished, he never mistook order for immortality. Watching the Colosseum's arches rise from the ground, he told Titus, "The crowd will cheer us today and curse us tomorrow. The trick is to outbuild their memory." He had no illusions of eternity, only of continuity. The first years of the Flavian regime proved that Rome could heal, but only if its rulers remembered that healing was work. In that labor, Vespasian found the purpose he had chased all his life. The muleteer had become emperor not to rule, but to keep the world moving. And for now, it did. Rome no longer needed miracles. It needed maintenance. Under Vespasian, the empire learned to breathe again, not in wonder, but in rhythm. His vision of rule was not carved in marble or gilded in gold. It was built from numbers, schedules, and sweat. The glory of the Flavian age was that it functioned. The emperor's mornings began before the sun rose above the Palatine. Couriers waited with reports from every corner of the empire. Ledgers from the treasury, manifests from the harbors, accounts from the legions. He read everything, remembered everything, and corrected mistakes in the margins. Those around him often mistook his patience for tedium, but it was the same precision that had carried him through the wars. For him, empire was arithmetic, grain, pay, and time kept in balance. The wealth seized from Jerusalem gave him the means to rebuild what chaos had destroyed. He did not squander it on palaces or monuments to himself, but on the infrastructure that bound the empire together. Aqueducts were repaired, bridges reinforced, and the capital restored. In the heart of the city, where Nero's lake had once sprawled in decadent stillness, foundations were laid for a new amphitheater. It would belong to the people, a monument to shared order after years of ruin. Even the city's texture began to change. The grandiloquence of Nero's marble was replaced with brick, the material of endurance. Markets reopened, streets were cleared of rubble, and fountains once fed by broken aqueducts ran again. The emperor's face was rarely seen, yet his presence was everywhere, in the cleanliness of a street, in the regularity of shipments arriving at the port, in the wages of a mason who had work again. Beyond the capital, he rebuilt the machinery of government that had corroded through neglect. The provinces were reorganized, corrupt governors replaced, taxes regularized. Where his predecessors had relied on spectacles, he relied on records. Reports were checked, inventories reconciled, and accounts made public. In distant cities, Lugdunum, Carthage, Antioch, Roman administration resumed its old cadence: harvest, tribute, transport. The empire began to feel coherent again, as if its arteries were clear after years of blockage. The army followed the same logic. Once fractured by politics, the legions were distributed strategically across provinces, their loyalty redirected to the state rather than individuals. Veterans received land in the territories they had secured, spreading Roman customs and order deep into the frontiers. Younger recruits, men born in Gaul, Thrace, or Cappadocia, entered service with a new understanding of citizenship, not a birthright, but a wage. Under Vespasian, Rome stopped pretending that its soldiers were Romans. It taught them to be reliable instead. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Within a few years, the empire that had been defined by crisis was defined by consistency. Grain reached the cities on schedule. Trade routes reopened, coinage regained its weight, and provincial uprisings dwindled. The word peace no longer sounded naive. The empire had rediscovered equilibrium, and that equilibrium was his greatest monument. His methods were not loved, but they worked. The senatorial elite complained that the empire had become too practical, too dull. They missed the poetry of Nero's, extravagance, and the thrill of danger. Yet behind their derision lay envy. The mule breeder from Reate had succeeded where their ancestors had failed. He had rebuilt the empire by treating it not as a symbol, but as a system. At the heart of this new order stood the amphitheater that rose on the ruins of Nero's golden house. The sound of chisels echoed through the forum as arches took shape and scaffolds filled the sky. It was a public monument in every sense, funded by war spoils, built by freedmen and artisans, intended for the crowd that had endured too much silence. When it was complete, it would dominate the city's skyline, a reminder that even entertainment could be reclaimed from tyranny. He did not govern through fear or charisma. His presence inspired something rarer: trust. People believed that their work would be paid for, that their taxes would be used, that the next sunrise would not bring another proclamation from a corpse's successor. This ordinariness was his achievement. The empire, weary of heroes, finally valued reliability. He managed his sons as he managed the state, with balance, though not without unease. Titus, steady and proven, shared in the duties of administration and won the affection of the people. Domitian, younger and restless, resented his father's caution and longed for his own arena. Within the family, as within the empire, discipline was the only glue holding ambition together. The dynasty's stability would depend not on blood, but on restraint. Vespasian's humor, so often misread as simplicity, was in fact armor. He laughed at himself because it disarmed others. It made the senators forget that he was auditing them, and the people forget that he was taxing them. Beneath the jokes, his will was absolute. He tolerated criticism, but never chaos, encouraged conversation, but ignored advice that smelled of flattery. His governance was built on a quiet certainty. That authority needed no spectacle if it could deliver results. The Flavian peace became a rhythm, predictable, methodical, strangely human. For the first time since Augustus, people planned beyond the present. Merchants invested in trade rather than bribes. Cities rebuilt without fear of confiscation, and families recorded births instead of funerals. The sense of collective exhaustion that had haunted Rome after Nero gave way to something close to gratitude. The empire no longer feared its emperor, and that itself was a revolution. Beyond Italy, the transformation was even more visible. Provinces that had once seethed under imperial taxes now saw Roman engineers repairing roads and harbors. Grain from Africa, wine from Gaul, and marble from Greece flowed again through ports that had been silent for years. In the east, local kings reaffirmed allegiance not because of fear, but because stability was profitable. Rome, once the bully of the world, had become its accountant. By his 9th year in power, the city gleamed again. The capital stood, restored, the forum thrummed with trade, and the Tiber's quays overflowed with ships. The amphitheatre neared completion, its arches shining in the afternoon light. To most Romans, these were signs of peace. To Vespasian, they were proof that diligence could outlast chaos. His rule was less a vision than a discipline, and in that discipline lay his immortality. Old age came without indulgence. He worked as he always had, driven by habit rather than ambition. When fever began to slow him, he refused to rest, dictating orders from his couch and reviewing ledgers between bouts of exhaustion. The empire could function without him now, his greatest success, but he could not yet imagine it doing so. In the final months of his reign, visitors noted that he seemed content. The city he had inherited in ashes now pulsed with energy, its people secure enough to grumble again. The empire's borders were calm, its treasuries full, its streets safe. He had restored the practical virtues Rome had once mistaken for weakness: thrift, consistency, responsibility. What he left behind was not grandeur, but reliability, a civilization that worked. As the amphitheatre's final stones were set, its foundations buried the last traces of Nero's indulgence. It was the perfect emblem of his rule, the conversion of decay into endurance. From the ruins of spectacle, he had built a structure that could outlast memory. The empire had learned, for a time, to measure greatness not in glory, but in balance. Peace no longer felt like an accident. After years of turmoil, Rome finally moved with purpose again, steady and sure, like an old soldier finding his stride. The legions drilled, merchants filled the ports, and the city hummed with the sound of restoration. Workmen clung to the upper arches of the Colosseum, chiseling the last details of its stone. Below, streets once silent under Nero's tyranny were alive with trade and gossip. Vespasian, now an aging man, watched it all from the Palatine and saw something he had not seen in a lifetime of campaigns: a world that functioned. He began each day before dawn, as if the empire might stop turning if he slept too long. Fever had already thinned him, but duty kept his hands moving through reports, edicts, and petitions. Those around him mistook his stubbornness for vanity. In truth, it was habit. The discipline that had built his life would not release him, even as it consumed what strength he had left. Every day, he signed decrees, resolved disputes, and questioned his officials until exhaustion forced him to stop. He worked as if order itself might vanish if he looked away. Beyond the palace walls, the order he had restored continued to deepen. The army, once the engine of rebellion, was now a pillar of restraint. The provinces sent tribute on time, and the harbors overflowed with goods from the known world. Rome had recovered its rhythm, but Vespasian viewed the calm with suspicion. He knew that stability was not peace. It was only the absence of noise. Years of war had taught him that human fortune turned quickly, and the same crowds who cheered an emperor 1 month might curse him the next. His task was to keep them too busy to remember how fickle they were. In these final years, power no longer excited him. It felt like another campaign, one he could not abandon until the job was finished. He ruled with the same clarity he had commanded in battle, spare in gesture, exact in language, quick to act when something broke. Glory was for the young. What mattered now was completion. The empire's accounts were balanced, the treasury full, the frontiers quiet. He had nothing left to prove, only to preserve. Age, however, eroded the armor of discipline. His step slowed, his appetite thinned. Friends urged him to rest, but he distrusted comfort. He kept his life as austere as his youth. Simple food, plain rooms, no performances or feasts. Even as Rome thrived on the energy of renewal, he lived like a farmer at harvest, counting, inspecting, preparing for what came next. Visitors who expected majesty found instead a tired man who still carried the empire like a ledger in his head. The Colosseum rose as the visible expression of his reign. Built from the gold of conquest, it was both celebration and warning, order replacing chaos, purpose redeeming waste. On the site where Nero's artificial lake had once shimmered in decadence, thousands of laborers now built a monument to civic joy. To the people, it was entertainment. To Vespasian, it was proof that even pleasure could be disciplined. The city had learned to channel its passions into something constructive, and that, for him, was civilization's highest art. His two sons embodied the empire he would leave behind. Titus, steady and loyal, had already proved himself as general and administrator. Domitian, restless and ambitious, wanted recognition he had not yet earned. Between them stretched the same fragile balance that defined their father's rule. Vespasian managed them with the same patience he used for provinces. He corrected, observed, waited. To outsiders, the Flavian dynasty looked unshakable. Within, it pulsed with rivalry. He knew it and accepted it. No emperor could train virtue into his heirs, only leave behind structures that could endure their mistakes. The decade of his reign hardened into legend even before it ended. Merchants spoke of fair taxation, soldiers of predictable pay, citizens of safety. The people no longer adored emperors as gods, but appreciated them as administrators. The empire's myth had become bureaucratic, and that, strangely, was its salvation. What had begun as exhaustion turned into belief. Belief that Rome could govern itself again, that competence was enough. As illness deepened, Vespasian retreated to Campania, to the quiet countryside where the air was soft and the noise of Rome only a memory. There, among vineyards and olive groves, he continued to work. Even in weakness, he refused idleness. His attendants found him dictating letters between bouts of fever, his voice rasping, his tone unchanged. The empire had learned his rhythms so well that it seemed to move with him, each decree echoing across the provinces like the measured steps of a familiar march. He died as he had lived, without flourish, without drama. One morning, unable to breathe, he ordered his attendants to lift him from his bed so that he might stand. It was his final act of discipline, a gesture that defined his life. He collapsed moments later, leaving behind a world still standing because he had insisted it should. The transition that followed was almost serene. The Senate confirmed Titus as emperor. The legions remained loyal. The city did not riot. After decades in which succession meant slaughter, Rome experienced a peaceful transfer of power. That calm was his last and greatest victory. The system he had rebuilt, its bureaucracy, its hierarchy, its sense of duty, outlived the man who had forged it. Titus continued his father's work, completing the Colosseum and inaugurating it with games that filled the air with dust and triumph. To the crowd, it was celebration. To historians, it became the symbol of a regime that had turned empire into maintenance. Domitian would later undo much of that balance with suspicion and fear. But even his cruelty could not erase what Vespasian had built. The roads, the laws, the institutions endured, practical as their founder. He left behind no mythic tales, no marble self-portraits carved as gods. His image in history remained what it had been in life. A man of the ordinary, made extraordinary by consistency. Others had ruled through fear, charm, or revelation. He ruled through endurance. The empire he shaped was not glorious, but it worked. And in the long memory of civilization, that would matter more than grandeur. Centuries later, when poets and chroniclers listed the emperors who saved Rome, his name always appeared quietly among them, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. He had taken a collapsing world and given it time. Where others had built monuments to themselves, he built one to function. The amphitheater, the tax system, the rebuilt provinces, each bore his signature, not in inscription, but in design. His was the legacy of infrastructure, of structure itself. In the long twilight of empire, his example remained. Strength without vanity, humor without cruelty, order without display. From a modest birth in the Sabine Hills to the summit of the world, his life traced the Roman ideal stripped of myth. A reminder that discipline could achieve what ambition destroyed. The empire's marble would one day crack, its emperors fade into legend. But the idea he embodied would survive. That greatness lies not in spectacle, but in endurance.